My name is Matthew Garrity. I come from DNV. It's one of the world's largest renewables advisory and certification bodies. But my relationship to decommissioning, particularly in the North Sea, is to do with Rewind, which is an internal startup at DNV, which is in operation for just over a year. We are trying to create digital products to help wind farm owners and operators better handle the challenges at end of life in terms of sustainability and also efficiency when it comes to costs of decommissioning at end of life.
My name is Joop Kolen. I'm a marine benthic ecologist. I specialize in reefs in the North Sea and I work at Wageningen Marine Research in the Netherlands. It's important to talk about the effects of decommissioning on the ecosystem because these structures are very numerous, especially in the future. We are going to build thousands of offshore wind turbines, and the removal of these structures after their lifetime might have its own effect on the ecosystem, which may differ than the initial effects of the building.
I'm Alexander Elferink and I'm a research associate at the Utrecht Center for Water, Oceans and Sustainability Law, and I'm also the director of the Netherlands Institute for the Law of the Sea. As that name indicates, I mostly occupy myself with questions relating to oceans from a legal perspective, and both Aquasol and NILOS are research institutes of Utrecht University's School of Law. My relationship with the duty of decommissioning is one of the relevant questions in international law of the sea. There's a lot of sea-based activities involving installations, and then one of the questions that arises is should these installations be removed once they are decommissioned, or could they also be reused, or could they have a value from the perspective of nature, for instance?
From an ecological perspective, decommissioning or removal of structures offshore after end of life is the taking away of the substrates, the rocks, the pipelines or the cables, and then bring it back to the condition the environment was in before the structure was built. That is not to say the natural condition, because the condition before it was built was already strongly influenced by mankind, for example by fishing or other activities. But it's the bringing back of this original condition before it was built.
The actual decommissioning process itself is really just a reverse installation process. We're using all the same machinery, all the same materials to try and take down the turbines and process them at end of life. So our model builds this up. It's a bottom-up model, so it takes into account vessel rates, it takes into account time at sea, for example, it takes into account the scrap price of various different metals, labour rates, plant hire, processing costs for materials, and really try to build it up in the exact same way that you would try and build up your installation costs as well.
From a legal standpoint, the duty of decommissioning first of all has to be assessed from the perspective of the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, which is a framework convention which is widely accepted as the basic regulatory framework for the ocean. And one of its provisions deals with the decommission of installations and structures. And if you look at that provision, it might seem to suggest that structures and installations have to be removed in totality, but if you take a closer look, it becomes apparent that you may also leave them in place partially. And in making an assessment how to go about decommissioning, you also have to take into account environmental and nature concerns that's specifically indicated in that provision.
I think the biggest key to unlocking potential value for projects at end of life is really having a clear vision, a clear overview as to what the materials are within your project. That's not just turbines, it's also the balance of plant, it's also foundations, and really understanding what you can do with those materials. If I was to decommission a building or demolish a building, the first thing we need to see is a blueprint of the building to understand what's in there and what can I do with everything. So it's really that knowledge sharing and access to that information is one of the key areas. I mean, there's so many more on the environmental impact side, as we talked about at the start. There's definitely huge questions as to whether cables should be left in situ, whether care protection should be left in situ, and I think understanding the environmental impacts of the actual decommissioning process itself is somewhere where we've done some good work, but I think more knowledge is definitely needed.
So if you build a structure in the North Sea, a wind farm or oil and gas platform or a shipwreck is present, then steel or concrete is present and is a different surface than the soft sediment that is naturally present in most of the Dutch North Sea, which is sand. And this is then colonized by a large amount of species. So far in most wind farms in the southern North Sea, first mussels colonize the structures, and in deeper parts anemones together with hydroids will dominate the structure. And then other species come in, surely but slowly. They take over a part of this colonized structure, especially the amphipods, and this can then explode. So in the sense that the numbers increase enormously. All these species can also be eaten by others, so their predators come in, and so in time the whole system will change to a system that is a habitat for 100, 200 species on a single turbine.
I think it would be important also to assess whether the removal could also damage the environment or nature values. So in certain instances you may even have to come to the conclusion that you should, from a perspective of nature, not decommission a part of a structure, or if that's also of course possible, take into account other interests like also security interests of navigation, because leaving an installation in place may of course pose risks to navigation.
In addition to the artificial reef effect and the increase of biodiversity locally in these, around these turbine foundations, I can quickly think of several potential negative effects. One that is often discussed is the increasing distribution of invasive species that colonize the structures together with all the others. These could step stone throughout the North Sea to other structures to colonize the North Sea faster. A second potential negative effect could be the presence of anti-fouling paint on the structure. I'm not sure if that is used, but if it's used, it should be considered during decommissioning or when structures are partially left in place. And a potential third effect is the type of anti-corrosion system that is used, especially when anodes are used. These leach chemicals in the water, which is their design to do so. And this should also definitely be considered during decommissioning activities.
There have been a small number of offshore projects that have been decommissioned, offshore wind projects. That is some of the earliest projects in Denmark have been decommissioned, and there's been a number of kind of example or demonstrator projects where turbines were erected for a short period of time that have been decommissioned as well. And we're yet to see our first kind of full utility scale project decommissioned, but it's an exciting time, and there's a number of projects that are kind of reaching that end of life right now, that are, well, not quite yet, but they need to start thinking about putting those plans in place. Again, with offshore, it's a bit more of a complicated process. An onshore project can start thinking about decommissioning kind of 2 to 5 years ahead of time, but we definitely recommend longer for offshore projects. There's just a lot more logistics and different parties that need to be involved.
I can imagine that you, for example, leave the scour protection in place and only remove the turbine foundation. The scour protection is often made of rocky materials. So this is relatively similar to natural reefs that are present in the North Sea. And I believe we definitely should study the potential of leaving the rock bed in these wind farms in place. The most non-indigenous species are present in the shallow parts and are mostly absent in the deeper parts. So you could remove, for example, the turbine foundations up to a depth of 5 or 10 meters above seabed, and then leave the rest in place.
It's not clear in the Law of the Sea Convention, I would say. It does not talk about artificial reefs explicitly, but so you have to assume that they're an installation. But if you look at the elaboration of specific guidelines, and that has been done by On the one hand, the International Maritime Organization, but also by the OSPAR, that's a regional organization for the protection of the Northeast Atlantic. They make a distinction between the decommissioning of installations on the one hand and there are specific guidelines also for artificial reefs. These are questions that will arise in the future, and I think it's good to already have a clear idea of what's required in the future. Also in terms of monitoring what's happening in the sense of creation of nature values at these installations or reefs, and I think it's good to have a clear picture beforehand, and also to take that into account, for instance, in tendering requirements, to set up tenders in such a way that they also take into account these kind of interests.
I think it's important that we start studying this in the near future, also in an international setting, working together with the other countries in the North Sea that have wind farms, because in the not too distant future companies will start removing the structures, and this is the time to learn from these processes.
Take-home messages for any listeners here are to plan for decommissioning well in advance. In fact, decommissioning should be planned for during the development phase, if possible. And there are ways to optimize and better plan for decommissioning throughout the life of a project. And we'd highly encourage any wind farm owners and operators to try and engage with the process early and not leave it to the last minute, if possible.
I think the viewers of this webinar should definitely think about the effects of decommissioning on the ecosystem, and then consider this during discussions or decisions on these decommissioning scenarios, and not ignore the potential of leaving parts in place. I believe the different effects of these decommissioning scenarios should also be studied in the near future.
I would say that in itself creating nature values by artificial reefs is in itself an interesting process, but I think we should not lose from sight that the impact of wind farms will be enormous, and I think it's equally or much more important that we also look at the overall health of the North Sea ecosystem and how we ensure that. And so also accept that there will be limitations on the kind of activities that we can engage in on the North Sea to protect nature.